Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is undoubtedly one of the most important games in the entire series, releasing 8 years ago but still leaving fans scratching their heads on what the game was actually trying to tell us. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 was one of the first games in the series that got very deliberate with its narrative, starting the game off with not a night or cutscene, but a minigame itself introducing some of the first actual human characters in the entire series. Here we meet the Crying Child and Michael Afton, two characters who will be incredibly important for discussing what happens in FNAF 4's other sequence, the Nightmares. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 throws us into a series of nights where we play as a small child stuck in our bedroom. Using only a flashlight, we are forced to face nightmarish versions of the FNAF animatronics by keeping an eye on the closet, bed, and by shutting doors on either side of the room. This gameplay sequence goes up until our 5th night, where instead of facing just the nightmares, we actually come face to face with Nightmare Fredbear himself appearing after 4 AM. Once we hit night 7, we also get to meet Nightmare, a black and gold counterpart of Nightmare Fredbear who replaces him when we hit 4 AM. It turns out this was actually Shadow Freddy returning for a more important role in the series, being a counterpart to Nightmare Fredbear just like Shadow Freddy is to Golden Freddy. Beyond the night gameplay itself, astute fans quickly picked up on a series of Easter eggs hidden around the room which help us crack the story of FNAF 4 wide open. Fans quickly noticed what appeared to be an IV drip, bottle of pills, and vase of flowers all lining the bedside, which connects to these nightmares taking place after the bite, with the Crying Child having already died at the hospital. However, we also quickly discovered very specific connections to the very first Five Nights at Freddy's, such as FNAF 4's game map mirroring the FNAF 1 office, and even garbled audio of the FNAF 1 calls playing during each night. Based on this, and the fact that Scott didn't fill this game with random Easter eggs, it's clear that Five Nights at Freddy's 4 tried telling the story of Michael Afton having these nightmares following the Crying Child's death, still haunted by his guilt. However, that's at least the original story of FNAF 4, but as we know, much of FNAF 4's story wasn't picked up on quick enough by the fans, especially concerning the nightmares. That's where Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location comes in, which is a game Scott actively used to fix a few misconceptions from FNAF 4. In FNAF Sister Location, if we enter the game's private room and input the code 1983 into a keypad on the wall, we unlock a series of cameras related to FNAF 4. That 1983 code was clearly used to clear up misconceptions by some fans about FNAF 4's date being 1987, but it also did something else incredibly special with FNAF 4. With Sister Location, Scott not only had to clear up a few misconceptions about FNAF 4, but actively find a way to ground FNAF 4's story, and he did just that with the experiment rooms. Earlier in Sister Location, during our break room face-off against Funtime Freddy, we see a map showing the Sister Location facility and its areas we are returning power to. If you pay close enough attention to the map though, you'd notice that we're returning power to a mysterious Observation 1 and Observation 2, which appear to actually link to the FNAF 4 neighborhood and FNAF 4 bedroom. Those cameras in the private room aren't showing the FNAF 4 bedroom itself, but what happens to be a series of observation rooms created by William as a part of the Sister Location facility. Based on these dots from the breaker room map, it appears that at some point William created a series of rooms likely resembling the Crying Child's where he created at least 4 nightmare animatronics to terrorize whoever was inside. It was actually around this time, just before the release of Sister Location and following the Silver Eyes, where we first began to see the mad scientist side of William Afton through the Twisted Ones. In that book, we met the Twisted Ones, a series of animatronics bearing striking resemblance to the nightmares, whose appearance were the result of illusion discs which messed with the viewer's perception. The book also bizarrely included a makeshift pizzeria built under the house of Fazbear co-creator Henry Emily, which would sound out of the blue normally, but makes a bit more sense considering the underground testing rooms we see in Sister Location. Based on that book, most assumed that FNAF 4's plot now involved William creating a series of underground experiment rooms connected to Sister Location, where he'd use sound illusion discs to create the nightmares and torment whoever was inside. And that's where the discussion sat for nearly 7 years, at least until the release of Dittophobia. Concluding Five Nights at Freddy's series Tales from the Pizzaplex was a story called Dittophobia, meaning the fear of repetition, where we followed a child named Rory who finds himself terrorized by a series of nightmarish animal creatures night after night. Unsurprisingly, each night these creatures invade his room, which has an identical layout to the FNAF 4 nightmares, with Bonnie and Chica coming from the hallways, Foxy at the closet, and Freddy rising up from the bed. After a few nights of this, a generator hidden in the rooms becomes unplugged, destroying the illusion and revealing to Rory that not only are his nightmares not real, but that he's no longer a 7-year-old child, but instead a 17-year-old who's been trapped in the experiment rooms for the last 10 years. In the story, he ends up exploring the rest of the Sister Location facility, which is completely abandoned, before returning to the observation rooms and being tricked by a recording of William into restarting the whole cycle. It appears that Dittophobia finally puts a bit more purpose to those experiment rooms, showing another hidden victim of Williams who is kept in a loop of the FNAF 4 nightmares for upwards of a decade. Based on notes Rory finds in a room which might bear resemblance to the Sister Location private room, it appears that these experiments were to study the effects of ongoing fear in children, leaving them to face the same horrors night after night with no real life during the daytime. Beyond that though, Dittophobia most importantly finally answered the question of what are the nightmares. Nearly 7 years ago when FNAF Sister Location first released, astute theorists like Dawko noticed something very interesting about the Sister Location facility itself. There are gas tanks all around the place, from the primary module to Circus Gallery, but most importantly all around the private control room. And now, what do we see nearly 7 years later in Dittophobia but a line of tanks filled with hallucinogenic gas feeding through vents into the FNAF 4 rooms. Vents just like the one we see right here in the FNAF 4 bedroom. The nightmares haven't been the work of illusion discs, but simply Halloween props rolling around on tracks and popping out from trapdoors made to look real by hallucinogenic gas. While that does finally answer some of the biggest questions posed in Sister Location, what we still need to figure out is how this story relates back to Five Nights at Freddy's 4. If we think back to FNAF 4, it was clear from that game that we played as Michael Afton being terrorized by nightmares of the animatronics. However, we never quite solved how that related to Sister Location. Following Sister Location's reveal of the experiment rooms, fans quickly tried connecting these nightmares of Michael's to the experiment rooms. Many theories explored the idea that these experiment rooms were actually made by William to terrorize Michael, giving him something to be sorry for running away in Midnight Motorist or following the death of his brother. On the other hand, it could also be the crying child, with William deliberately making him afraid of the animatronics. After all, he is clearly terrified of them for some reason in FNAF 4, and why wouldn't that be from William giving him something to be truly afraid of? If that were the case, it would be possible that following his death in the bite, the crying child or perhaps Shadow Freddy would come to haunt Michael over his regret, inflicting the nightmares on him as punishment like how we see them outside his house in FNAF 4. Ultimately, with all these theories, we have to find a way to tie them back somehow to the experiment rooms in Dittophobia with how much of them it shows, but the problem is they don't really seem to connect. When it comes to Dittophobia, you have what is very clearly a child used for William's research into fear being abandoned when he no longer needed that project, being left caught in a loop for upwards of 10 years. Then all the way back in FNAF 4, you have Michael and maybe even the crying child suffering nightmares of the same animatronics, though with a bit more tacked on. Dittophobia makes it very clear that Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare were never real animatronics, so those characters are special for Michael's versions of the nightmares. Assuming the experiment rooms were made pretty early in the timeline, it would make sense for William's experiments to have somehow influenced Michael or the crying child. But the problem is there just isn't that connection there. Rory is a random kid, some unknown victim of Williams like Andrew, who remains pretty disconnected from the main story for over a decade. His experience is so isolated that nobody ever finds him, at least not until the events of Sister Location, and you'd think that would reflect his impact on the story as well. Dittophobia just simply doesn't give us a way for Rory's nightmares to have seeped out to Michael or the crying child, at least not from the angle we're looking at it. Remember, I started this with assuming that the experiment rooms are what created the nightmares, but what if we flipped it around? What if it was actually one of the Aftons who first started having nightmares, inspiring William to create the experiment rooms in the first place? If it were the crying child, he'd likely be having nightmares after whatever he thinks he saw at Fredbear's family diner. It's clear that something ended up scaring him before the events of FNAF 4, and that might serve as a perfect candidate for giving him nightmares of the Freddy's animatronics, maybe even just of Fredbear. If that were true, then it's possible that whatever haunts Michael after the bite might be inflicting those same nightmares his brother had on him, giving him something to be afraid of. In my last video, I tackled this exact topic, drawing a connection between the nightmare animatronics outside of the FNAF 4 house and the mound in Midnight Motorist, suggesting that if the crying child was buried out there, Michael might have brought home a little more than just Shadow Freddy, but also the nightmares that would end up haunting him for decades to come. In the wake of the bite, William hearing about Michael's nightmares and maybe connecting them to the ones the crying child could have had before his death would make him realize that they might be the key to what happened to him and maybe even putting him back together. William would then create a series of experiment rooms underground as a recreation of the crying child's room, even adding his favorite plastic purple telephone. Then he'd kidnap a child named Rory, one who we frankly know very little about, but who would be useful to getting the experiments rolling. If that is the true story of FNAF 4, and it was in fact the nightmares that came before the experiments unlike what most fans think, then what does that mean mean for Dittophobia? Ultimately, what would that story's purpose be if the experiments weren't where the nightmares started? Well, notice that following the release of Sister Location, while Scott did technically succeed in grounding the nightmares, he accidentally created another misconception that would end up lasting the next 7 years. By creating the experiment rooms, he was able to ground the story of FNAF 4 from being all a dream to most theorists, but he inadvertently made the fandom ask who those experiments were for. Since we assumed Michael or the Crying Child were the ones having them as early as FNAF 4, the fandom has still been hellbent on proving that either one of them was who those rooms were made for. If we've been trying to fit characters like Michael and the Crying Child into parts of the story where they don't fit, then what better for Scott to do than create a story that shows us a character that fills that role instead? Rory may not be cosmically important or even satisfying in the story of Five Nights at Freddy's, but the hole he fills in the story is incredibly important for concluding a debate we've held for nearly 7 years, which turns out wasn't really important to begin with. I believe we may have even seen something like this already happen in the series, with the introduction of Hudson Foster as the FNAF 3 guard in Fazbear Frights. Ultimately, the only way for Scott to answer some of the biggest questions in the series is often to either ignore the ones that became too big for their own good, or show how they really shouldn't have been questions in the first place. And that's the FNAF 4 secret that changed everything. Hopefully with this video, we can say we actually finally solved the biggest secret in FNAF 4. What the fuck?